But there's more to sanctions than just having the laws in place. And it merits study. What is it that makes the US so effective in being able to reach around the world with its sanctions regime? So the first thing is US persons, wherever they operate, are obliged to follow US law. Right now, when we say persons, we mean institutions, entities, individuals. The second dimension is the use of the US financial system, which is that over 70 to 80%, depending on where you're looking at the data, of world trade and indeed fund transfers involve the US dollar one way or the other. So you need to look at how payments work, but just take my word for it. If the currency involved is dollar, it touches the US financial system. And if it touches the US financial system, that means there is someone, usually a bank in New York, but sometimes can be a bank in San Francisco as well, or indeed any other financial center in the US, but usually New York and then San Francisco. There would be a bank in that location that could be held responsible for violation of sanctions. I'm going to be sharing a number of cases so that you, as a practitioner, are left in no doubt that if you so much as have a toehold in the US anywhere, and you think you're operating in Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, or wherever else on the planet, and that you can get away with whatever you're doing in that other location, this little toe that you have in the US will be caught and the sanctions violator will be reeled in. Finally, the Export Administration Regulation, which is overseen by the implementing agency, is the Bureau of Industry and Security. Because US is the crucible in many ways of most of the innovations that we see on the planet, either at pure research stage or in design stage or in manufacturing stage or in execution, you end up wanting US computer chips or 3D printing machines or electric vehicle battery technology, whatever, right? So that then becomes the other reason, or indeed nuclear spare parts or nuclear equipment, airline spare parts. We're going to see all these cases as we work our way through sanctions. For example, the number of air crashes and civilian deaths that happen in Iran because US aircraft supplies don't reach Iran. So a regime which says it doesn't need the US does need spare parts, even if it is using old third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand Boeings to run its national airline fleet. And so, to revisit that or go a little deeper into that, any dealing by a US person with anywhere else in the world, the involvement of a US person is a trigger, a hold, a catch for US sanctions. If the products being traded are prohibited under the Export Administration Regulations regime, that too is a trigger for US sanctions. If any financial settlement of a transaction involves the use of the US financial system, and as I have said before, if the payment is to be made in dollars, if the transfer of funds, one leg of the transfer of funds involves dollars, then you're using the US financial system. It is a trigger for US sanctions. And of course, since dollar is the dominant currency, that is the biggest weapon. Okay, now there's the US with these three tools: US persons, US financial systems, US products. And it barricades a targeted nation. Nothing shall touch. Look at that thick gray line. Nothing shall cross that line. And then the targeted country says, we do not travel to the US. We do not want US goods. We do not use the US dollar. Now, country like Iran, North Korea, ostensibly those are the positions that they hold. Now, while they may not travel to the US and while they may manage to not use the US dollars, they do end up wanting US goods and services, whether that's Google, Amazon, cloud servers, whether that's internet related technology, nuclear technology, rocket technology, missile technology. It's a pretty long list. When we do European sanctions, we will look at dual use goods in greater depth. And you might ask me, hey, why aren't you doing dual use goods in complete depth while looking at US sanctions? That's just to provide you with some variety. A dual use good is a dual use good. Its character doesn't change. For example, formaldehyde can be used to create chemical weapons, so it appears on the dual use goods list in relation to Iran. We'll keep that for EU sanctions and understand that it could be implemented in exactly the same way for the same reasons in US sanctions, right? So US goods is actually a large part of the story. And we're going to look at some extremely interesting and exciting cases where how does North Korea use conduits? How does Iran use conduits? Everything is traceable, trackable. The US comes to know of the use of these conduits at some point in time in the evolution, by which time some breach, some violation, some contact, some technology has already been stolen or used, and so on. So, there are countries then like Japan, Taiwan, all the petrodollar states, which is the oil exporting countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so on, China, South Korea. These are countries, I mean, it's not a comprehensive list, but this is a significant list of countries that have dealings with the US, big partner, but with some of those sanctioned regimes through direct and indirect means as well. I mean, yes, with China direct, with North Korea, as I will show you when we do APAC sanctions, but also indirectly, countries like the petrodollar states or Japan or South Korea would not want to be caught offending the US directly. So, in addition to other attributes, the US is also the largest market for many products. If you want to improve the economic conditions in your country and grow rich, you do exactly what individuals do: find rich customers. And the US is the richest and the largest customer, including for low-tech consumer products, because high-tech is a different ball game. But if you're making soft toys, that's your skill set, not particularly a technologically advanced, though it's a beautiful skill to have, the US is a great place to sell and become rich. So the US is a large target market for every other country of the world, no exceptions. And China's rise to economic power is based on selling whatever the Americans will buy, manufacture it at crazy costs in huge scale, dump it on the US. That happened till 2009 at least. And China became rich. The other thing is that people need US, as I've already said, for technological innovative products. That is why in many sanctions wordings, you will find the following phrase used by the US: coveted access to the USA. Everybody wants access to the US. Okay. So one of the ways in which sanctioned entities or targets contemplate that access is via third countries. Okay. So what US legislation does is it bans transactions via third countries. It bans people from targeted country traveling to third countries and the US, or vice versa. It bans people from the US or third countries traveling to the targeted country. For instance, if you are a person from China that's been to Iran and on a later trip you arrive at a US airport, expect to be asked, maybe detained. Okay. And of course, ban products. Now, the left of the screen, the left hand side of the screen, is primary sanctions territory, which is that if you are in the US, you are expected to follow US law. That's primary sanction. But trying to curb indirect contact with the target is usually categorized as secondary sanctions. So, secondary sanctions have the character of extending the jurisdiction of the sanctioning country, trying to have US law or some version of it followed in, for example, Singapore. US law does not extend to Singapore, but US sanctions, having them take effect in Singapore, is secondary sanctions. Right? And by isolating them thus, you achieve compliance or you shoot for compliance, which means Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, after seeing what happened to Saddam Hussein, voluntarily opened up his country to inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency and various others to convince the world through transparency that he had no weapons of mass destruction. They do not need to consider him as being similar to Saddam. Now, what happened next to Gaddafi is a separate topic, but just that. Now, this kind of thing works because, country with the highest import value worldwide is the United States. Share of trade of US goods exported from China is 14.7%. China is the highest export value, so China is heavily dependent on export markets. All of these give US, and as I have said, if trade is denominated in dollars, then you need the US financial system, coveted access to markets. All of these things make the US uniquely positioned. If the US implements sanctions, announces sanctions, you have little choice but to comply. But if this same approach was taken by any other country of the world, so primary sanctions, yes, an India, a France, a Germany, a UK can enforce on its own citizens their own country law. No brainer. But secondary sanctions and being able to surround the target and isolate them into compliance. Even the EU or UK have a limited sphere of influence. So, in international relations, if the UK wanted to achieve something which caught the UK's attention, they would diplomatically get the US involved so that they have the US behind them. So, make no mistake about it, the US is the big boy. There's a second big boy, China, which we will look at separately. But China is looking to use sanctions. US has already been using sanctions for decades. When we look at Cuba, you will realize it's quite old. Or even Iran, for that matter, is at least since 1979 Iran revolution.